Arthur always considered his evening glass of red wine a small, well-deserved reward. He could never have imagined that this reward would one day present him with a bill he could barely pay. At 60 years old after retiring, Arthur's days had become much the same. The silence in the house, left behind after his wife's passing, became especially deafening in the evenings. And this ritual, the heavy decanter, the familiar sound of the cork, the deep ruby color in the glass, became his lifeline, a way to shield himself from loneliness and draw a line under another day lived. What's wrong with one glass? He often told himself, settling into his favorite armchair in front of the television. Doctors on TV even say it's good for the blood vessels and the heart. The main thing is to know your limit. And Arthur was sure he knew his limit. One glass, never more. It was his unbreakable mantra, his justification. He didn't see it as an addiction, only a small weakness that made his evenings a little warmer and cozier. But his body had begun to send him signals, which he stubbornly ignored. First, his sleep was disturbed. He would fall asleep easily, his head barely touching the pillow, lulled by the pleasant heaviness in his body after the wine. But in the middle of the night, usually at 3 or 4 in the morning, he would wake up as if from a jolt. His heart would be pounding in his chest at a frantic pace. There was a ringing in his ears, and a cold sweat would break out on his forehead. He would sit up in bed, try to catch his breath, and be unable to fall back asleep. The hours spent in the darkness until dawn were the longest. In the morning, he would wake up feeling broken, with a heavy head and a complete lack of energy. "It's just old age," Arthur would sigh, brewing himself a strong coffee to chase away the morning fog. "At my age, nobody sleeps like a baby anymore." Then the problems with his blood pressure began. The monitor he faithfully used every morning started showing strange numbers. Despite the pills he took strictly on schedule, his pressure would fluctuate. One moment it was almost normal. The next, it would spike to dangerous levels. Sometimes, when getting up from his chair, he would feel a sudden dizziness, and the room would swim before his eyes for a second. He blamed it on the weather, on fatigue, on anything but his evening ritual. The monitor is probably acting up, he decided, putting the tonometer away in a drawer. Or it's time to change the pills. The critical moment came on an unremarkable Tuesday. The day passed as usual. In the evening, Arthur, as always, poured himself some wine. The news on TV was boring, and after finishing his glass, he decided to go to the kitchen for a glass of water. He rose from the armchair, and in that moment, the world turned upside down. The floor disappeared from under his feet, the walls tilted, and the ceiling began to spin at a furious speed. A terrible weakness seized his body. His legs felt like cotton. He managed to put out his hands and grab onto the doorframe to keep from falling. His heart wasn't just beating, it was hammering against his ribs like a bird against the bars of a cage, trying to break free. He couldn't catch his breath, and black spots danced before his eyes. A single thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, flashed through his mind. This is the end. He stood there for several minutes, clutching the doorframe with whitened knuckles, afraid to move. When the spell subsided, leaving behind a sticky fear and a ringing weakness, Arthur knew this couldn't go on any longer. The next day, pale and frightened, he sat in his doctor's office. He told him everything about the poor sleep, the pressure spikes, the previous night's episode, and hesitatingly, He mentioned his one glass. The doctor, an elderly and wise man, was silent for a long time, and then he looked him straight in the eye. "Arthur," he said quietly but firmly, "let's be frank. What you call your reward, your body perceives as poison. Alcohol, even in small doses, acts very differently in older people. It dilates the blood vessels and then causes them to spasm sharply. Your blood pressure pill tries to dilate them, and the wine tries to constrict them. You are staging a full-blown war inside your body. That's why your pressure is jumping like crazy. That's why you wake up at night with a racing heart. It's your body trying to process the toxin while you sleep. What happened to you yesterday was a hypertensive crisis. You were incredibly lucky that it didn't end in a fall, a fracture, or a stroke." Arthur sat there, stunned by these words. His cozy, harmless ritual, his only comfort in an empty house, turned out to be a disguised enemy that was slowly and methodically destroying him from the inside. For the first time, he clearly saw the connection between the glass in his hand, the sleepless nights, the dizziness, and the chilling terror he had experienced the day before. He thought the wine was helping him live. It turned out it was helping him die. Eleanor was always told that movement is life, and she, at 72, had made this motto her religion. Unlike many of her peers who complained of fatigue and ailments, Eleanor was determined to fight old age to the very end. Every morning, in any weather, she would lace up her old but comfortable sneakers and go to war. A war against wrinkles, against extra weight, against frailty. Her battlefield was the city park, and her weapons were her steps. 10,000 steps, not one less. She had a pedometer, and the numbers on its small screen were more important to her than the time on a clock. She didn't stroll, she marched, with a straight back, a determined gaze, and pursed lips, overtaking young mothers with strollers and couples in love. At first she felt wonderful. Bursts of energy, sound sleep, pride in her willpower. But after a few months, the body she was so diligently training began to timidly send signals of protest. At first, it was a dull, aching pain in her right knee. It would appear towards the end of her walk and disappear after a short rest. "It's nothing serious," Eleanor told herself. "It's lactic acid. The muscles are working. A little pain means it's having an effect." She remembered a coach from her distant youth shouting, "No pain, no gain." And she believed it. To her, pain was proof that she was doing everything right, that she wasn't giving up. Then, the pain became her constant companion. It would start halfway through her walk, and sometimes the pain in her hip would join in. Eleanor began to limp, but stubbornly continued on her path. She took painkillers before leaving the house and convinced herself that her joints just needed to be worked through, that if she stopped, it would only get worse. She would rust over and never be able to walk again. Her old sneakers, with their almost worn smooth soles, seemed the most comfortable in the world. She was so used to them that the thought of buying new ones felt like a betrayal of her faithful comrades in arms. The climax came on a cold autumn day. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and a piercing wind was blowing. Eleanor was walking along the farthest path in the park when the pain in her knee turned from an ache into a sharp, shooting agony. She stopped for a moment, winced, but then forced herself to keep going. "Just a little more, almost there," she coaxed herself. And at that moment, as she transferred her weight to her right leg, to climb a small bridge. There was a quiet but distinct crunch. It was followed by a flash of blinding pain, so intense that her vision darkened. Her leg gave way. Eleanor cried out and miraculously managed to grab the cold railing of the bridge to keep from collapsing onto the pavement. She stood there trembling, unable to believe what had happened. The pain was nauseating, pulsating. Any attempt to put weight on her leg was met with a new, unbearable wave of agony. She was trapped, far from home, alone, helpless. Tears of humiliation and despair rolled down her cheeks. She had to do what she feared most, admit defeat. With trembling hands, she took out her phone and called her son. I can't walk, she whispered into the phone. And in those words, her entire world, built on strength and independence, crumbled. In the orthopedic surgeon's office, she sat huddled, looking at her old sneakers, which now seemed to her to be the main evidence of her crime against her own body. The doctor carefully studied the X-ray, then looked at Eleanor. "Your persistence is admirable," he said, without a hint of irony. "But you have confused persistence with self-abuse. Doctors do indeed say that walking is beneficial, but no one says you should walk until you grind your joints to dust. Imagine your knee is a car tire. You've been driving on it every day over potholes at high speed without changing or inflating it. What would happen to it? It would wear out and burst. You've done the same thing to your cartilage. You didn't just wear it down. You caused severe inflammation. The pain you felt wasn't muscles working. It was your body's cry for help. A stop signal that you ignored." He picked up one of her sneakers and bent it in half. "And this," he continued, "is no longer a shoe. It's just a piece of cloth that provides no support for your foot, which caused the entire load to go straight to your knee. You weren't strengthening your legs, Eleanor. You were purposefully destroying them." The doctor's words were harsh but sobering. For the first time, Eleanor understood how dangerous a blind faith in healthy habits could be. She thought she was fighting old age, but in reality, she was only accelerating its arrival. She realized that true health is not about self-abuse, but about a dialogue with one's body. It is a delicate art of knowing not only when to push, but also when to relax, not only when to move forward, but also when to stop and rest. Her path to true strength would have to begin not with 10,000 steps, but with one most difficult step. A step towards accepting and respecting her body. For George, who had recently turned 65, the coziest place in the house was the kitchen after midnight. When the whole world grew quiet, and the long shadows from the street lamp painted patterns on the floor, he found solace in the warm light above the table. The silence, which felt oppressive with its emptiness during the day after his wife's death, became different at night, peaceful and calm. And in this silence, his best friends were a box of oatmeal cookies and a carton of milk. It wasn't hunger in the usual sense. During the day, George ate quite moderately. But the late-night snack was a ritual, a way to fill a void not in his stomach, but in his soul. Watching an old movie felt incomplete without the crunch of a cookie. Anxious thoughts retreated in the face of sweetness and the warmth of milk. "What's the big deal?" he would reason, dipping another cookie into his glass. "I don't drink. I don't smoke. It's just a little pleasure at the end of the day to help me sleep better." But his sleep wasn't getting any better. On the contrary, it had turned into a restless, intermittent state. George often woke up in the middle of the night, with a burning pain behind his breastbone that rose to his throat, leaving a sour taste in his mouth. His nightstand was cluttered with bottles of antacids. "My stomach has gotten weak with age," he would complain to himself. "It's probably still the after effects of my late wife's spicy cooking." He didn't connect this nightly heartburn with the cookies he had eaten just a couple of hours earlier. Moreover, he began to be troubled by vivid, anxious dreams, after which he would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, feeling as if he had been unloading train cars all night. In the morning, he was sluggish and apathetic. His waistline was relentlessly expanding, and his old pants no longer fit around his belly. "Well, what can you do? My metabolism isn't what it used to be," he would sigh, giving up on it. The alarm bell rang, where he least expected it, in the sterile, clean doctor's office during a routine checkup. George wasn't worried. Apart from the heartburn and fatigue, he felt quite healthy. Imagine his surprise when a week later, the clinic called and insistently asked him to come in for a follow-up consultation to discuss his test results. The doctor's expression was serious. "George, I've received your blood tests," he began, "and frankly, they are very concerning. Your blood sugar level is in the pre-diabetic range, and your triglyceride level, which is fat in the blood, is through the roof." George listened, unable to believe his ears. Diabetes? Him? He barely ate sweets during the day. The doctor began to question him in detail about his diet, and when George, somewhat embarrassed, got to his late-night sessions with cookies, the doctor raised a hand, stopping him. "There it is," he said quietly. "This is the root of the problem." "But doctor, it's just a couple of cookies," George protested. "Understand, George?" the doctor began to explain patiently. "Our body is a smart factory that lives by a strict schedule, by its own internal clock. During the day when you're active, all its departments work at full capacity, burning the fuel you give it. At night, the factory closes for maintenance and repairs. The cells need to cleanse and regenerate. Now imagine that you, 5 minutes before the gates close, drive a whole truckload of sugar and fat up to this factory. What happens? The factory management panics. It's forced to call in the sleepy, inefficient night shift. Your stomach, which should be resting, is forced to produce acid, but it can't handle the job. Hence, your agonizing heartburn. Your pancreas, seeing an avalanche of sugar, panics and releases a huge amount of insulin. But the body's cells are asleep at night. Their doors are closed, and they refuse to accept this sugar. As a result, it remains floating in your blood, poisoning your vessels. And the fats from the cookies and milk, with nowhere to go, are sent straight to long-term storage, to the fat cells on your belly. You thought you were giving yourself a little pleasure, but in reality, you were putting your body in crisis mode every single night, forcing it to work to the point of exhaustion at the very time it desperately needed to rest. The doctor's explanation was like a light suddenly switched on in a dark room. All the disparate pieces, the heartburn, poor sleep, fatigue, growing belly, and finally the alarming numbers on the test results came together into a single frightening picture. His quiet, cozy nightly pleasure turned out to be an act of self-destruction. He had never thought that when he ate could be just as important as what he ate. The emptiness he was trying to fill with food required something else entirely: rest and recovery. George realized that his path to health would begin not with diets and restrictions, but with one simple action: learning to close the kitchen door after dinner and allowing his body the rest it deserved. Margaret had always been proud of her self-sufficiency and love for solitude. At 75, a former librarian, she had built a perfect world for herself, consisting of silence, order, and thousands of books that were her most faithful friends. After her husband passed away and her children moved to different countries, she didn't feel abandoned. On the contrary, she saw it as a gift, an opportunity to finally live entirely for herself, without the need to adapt to others' schedules and moods. She erected an invisible fortress of silence around her home and her life. "I gave my whole life to others, my husband, my children, the readers at the library," she would tell herself while watering the geraniums on her windowsill. "Now, it's my time. Time for peace." Her days were scheduled to the minute and filled with quiet rituals: morning coffee with a book, gardening, classical music in the afternoon, and watching black and white films in the evening. When a kind-hearted neighbor invited her for tea, Margaret would politely but firmly decline. "Thank you, dear, but I have so much to do today." In reality, she had no urgent tasks. The mere thought of having to maintain small talk for an hour made her cringe internally and seemed like a pointless waste of precious energy. Phone calls from old friends became less frequent. Margaret would respond in monosyllables, ask no questions in return, and the conversation would quickly fade. She didn't want to offend anyone. She just wanted to be left alone. But strange things began to happen within the walls of her quiet fortress. At first, they were minor things she attributed to fatigue. One day, she couldn't recall the last name of a favorite actress whose movie she had watched the night before. Another time, she spent half an hour searching the house for her glasses, which were on her head the whole time. She started leaving her house keys in the most unexpected places: in the refrigerator, in a flower pot. It was annoying, but not frightening. "I've just become absent-minded, it happens," she would brush it off. Then things became more difficult. Reading, her greatest pleasure, began to turn into torture. She could reread the same paragraph several times, but the meaning would slip away. Complex plot lines she used to unravel with ease now became tangled in her mind. She began to notice that she was increasingly choosing magazines with pictures over thick novels. Her world, once as boundless as the universe, began to shrink to the size of her living room. Along with her memory, her personality changed. Once calm and rational, Margaret became suspicious and anxious. Every rustle outside the window seemed like a threat. She stopped leaving the house after dusk. Her fortress was slowly turning into a prison, and she was becoming both the prisoner and the warden. The catastrophe, as is often the case, was quiet and almost unnoticeable from the outside. Her daughter, Sarah, who lived overseas, called for their usual Sunday chat. But this time, something was wrong. Her mother's voice was distant, and the conversation lacked logic. Margaret asked what the weather was like 3 times in 10 minutes. She couldn't remember what they had talked about just a minute before. There were notes of confusion and fear in her voice. Alarmed, Sarah bought a plane ticket without telling her mother, and 2 days later, stood on her doorstep. What she saw shocked her. The house, which had always been spotlessly clean, was in a state of quiet neglect. Piles of unopened mail lay on the kitchen table. She found a carton of milk in the bread box and moldy bread in the refrigerator. But the most frightening thing was Margaret herself. She greeted her daughter with a smile, but there was a lack of recognition in her eyes, as if she didn't fully realize who was standing in front of her. She was wearing a warm cardigan inside out. Sarah's heart ached. This was not her mother, the erudite, witty, and composed woman. This was a frightened, confused person, lost in her own home. In the geriatric specialist office, Margaret sat in silence, while Sarah haltingly explained the changes she had observed. The doctor listened attentively, performed a few simple memory and attention tests, and then turned to Margaret with a kind smile. "Margaret," he said gently, "imagine your brain is the most powerful muscle in the world. Any muscle needs exercise to stay in shape, and social interaction is the most important and complex workout for the brain. When you're just chatting with a neighbor about the weather, your brain is performing a colossal task. It's retrieving words from memory, analyzing facial expressions and intonation, and forming logical chains. It's a real mental gymnastic. By building a wall of silence around yourself, you've deprived your brain of this exercise. You've put it on a starvation diet. Understand, loneliness is not just an emotional state. It's a severe biological stress on the body that triggers chronic inflammation and increases the levels of hormones that literally destroy brain cells. Your memory problems are not just old age. They are a direct consequence of informational and emotional isolation." Margaret listened, and for the first time in a long time, the thick fog in her head began to clear. She had always considered her mind her private, inviolable sanctuary. The idea that this sanctuary needed other people to stay healthy and orderly had never occurred to her. She thought she was protecting herself from the hustle and bustle of the world. But in reality, she was depriving her brain of vital nourishment. The silence she had craved had turned out to be toxic. She looked at her daughter's worried face and understood that the fortress she had so carefully built had become her trap. And to save her mind, she had to do the hardest thing: find the strength to walk to the gate and open it. Samuel, who had recently turned 70, lived by a simple and, as he saw it, unbreakable code: men don't complain. A former construction worker, accustomed to physical labor and harsh conditions, he despised any weakness, especially in himself. Pain was something to be endured. Fatigue was to be ignored. Illness was to be weathered on one's feet. He considered a trip to the doctor an extreme measure, an almost humiliating admission of his own defeat in the face of some ailment. For decades, his wife, Martha, had waged a quiet war with him, trying to get him to at least have a routine checkup. But he would always brush her off with a gruff tenderness. "Martha, stop it. If something's wrong with me, I'll feel it. For now, I'm perfectly fine." But he was wrong. He did feel it. He just refused to listen. His body had been trying to scream at him for a long time, but he stubbornly plugged his ears. First, the shortness of breath appeared. Climbing to the second floor of their apartment became a real ordeal. At the top, he would stop, leaning heavily on the railing, pretending to look for his keys in his pocket, until his racing heart calmed down and his breathing evened out. "I'm just not in the shape I used to be. Need to walk more," he told himself. Then, his ankles began to swell. By evening, the elastic bands of his socks would dig into his skin so deeply that they left red furrows that wouldn't fade until the morning. "I must be eating too much salt, or these new shoes are too tight," he would find another explanation. A dry, hacking cough joined these symptoms. It was particularly vicious at night. As soon as Samuel lay down, a coughing fit would literally choke him, forcing him to sit up in bed. Eventually, he started sleeping propped up, surrounded by pillows. Martha begged him to see a doctor, suspecting allergies or asthma. Samuel just waved her off. "I caught a cold somewhere. It'll pass." And on top of all this lay a thick, impenetrable veil of fatigue. This wasn't the pleasant tiredness after a job well done that he had known all his life. It was an all-consuming powerlessness that would set in by midday and turn any simple action, whether reading the newspaper or washing the dishes, into an overwhelming task. He attributed it all to a single universal cause that, in his opinion, explained everything: age. "I'm 70, he would say, when Martha looked at him with concern yet again. "How do you think I should feel? Like I'm floating like a butterfly?" The climax came on a sunny day in May. His son and 6-year-old grandson, Leo, came to visit. The boy adored his grandfather and immediately dragged him into the yard to play catch. Samuel, wanting to show he still had it, readily agreed. They were just tossing a light baseball back and forth, standing a few feet apart. No serious exertion. But after just 5 minutes, Samuel felt the air become thick, as if he were breathing through a wet cloth. The familiar shortness of breath returned, but this time it was all-consuming. And then, an invisible slab settled on his chest. It wasn't a sharp pain, but a monstrous, crushing pressure, as if someone enormous was sitting on his chest. The world before his eyes began to dim. The ball fell from his weakened hand. Stumbling, he made his way to a garden bench and collapsed onto it, gasping for air that wouldn't fill his lungs. For the first time in his life, his body's rebellion was so public and so terrifying that it was impossible to ignore. In the hospital, everything was a blur. The flurry of doctors, injections, wires attached to his chest. Later, after the crisis had passed, a cardiologist, a calm, serious, middle-aged man, entered the room. He sat next to the bed and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. "Samuel," he began in a steady voice, "I want you to understand something. Everything you've been attributing to old age for the past few years was actually a crystal-clear set of symptoms for one specific disease: congestive heart failure. It means your heart, your engine, has weakened and can no longer work at full capacity. The shortness of breath when you climb the stairs, that's not because you're out of shape. It's because your weak heart couldn't keep up with pumping blood, and fluid began to accumulate in your lungs. The swelling in your legs, the same reason. Your circulation was impaired, and gravity pulled the fluid down. The nightly cough, that was your lungs trying to get rid of this excess fluid as soon as you lay down. Your body wasn't complaining. It was screaming for help in the only language it has, the language of symptoms. Old age is not a disease, Samuel. It's just a time of life. But your illness is a specific condition that we could have been successfully managing for years if you had just listened." Samuel was silent, stunned. His entire life's philosophy, his code of being a real man, crumbled to dust under the doctor's calm words. His pride, his stubbornness, his refusal to complain had nearly cost him his life. He thought he was being strong, but in reality, he was being fatally negligent toward the only body he had. He looked at Martha's tear-streaked but relieved face and understood everything. The stories of Arthur, Eleanor, George and Margaret, they all led to this moment. Whether it was a harmless glass of wine, a healthy walk to the point of exhaustion, a comforting midnight snack, or peaceful solitude, the common thread running through all these lives was the same: the habit of not listening to the quiet warnings of one's body. The final lesson was simple and yet incredibly complex. The greatest wisdom that comes with age is not the ability to ignore your body's signals, but to finally learn to understand its language. True strength is not silent endurance, but the courage to ask for help in time.